Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video where we're going to dive back into our friends at Extra History today for a story that doesn't get talked about a whole lot in American history. This is the Battle of Blair Mountain. This is actually, post-Civil War, the largest act of violence to take place in the United States in terms of the number of people involved. We're talking about more than 10,000 combatants in the Battle of Blair Mountain. And this has taken place in kind of the same area where the Hatfield and McCoy feud went on. This is coal miners and union workers versus the government. It's got all that kind of intrigue, and it's just a fascinating and also a very tragic story. So I'll put the link down in the description that'll take you to the beginning of episode 1 over on Extra History. We're going to do both parts, part 1 and part 2, as one reaction video today. So sit back and enjoy. Let's dive into this one.
Matewan, West Virginia, May 19th, 1920. Police Chief Sid Hatfield stands waiting near a railroad station. 12 deputized men surround the area.
So Sid Hatfield, you hear that name right away, right? And you think Hatfield. So Sid Hatfield's actually born in Pike County, Kentucky, which is kind of McCoy territory. The Hatfields and McCoys, we should cover that at some point. I'm going to go down there. I've been long overdue to get back to Eastern Kentucky. It's where my family's from. And I have roots in Pike County where a lot of this took place. Matewan, West Virginia is just across the Tug River. That's Hatfield territory. So Sid is not really directly descended from the part of the family that's involved in the feud. I think his grandfather and Devil Ance's grandfather were brothers. So he's kind of like a second cousin to Devil Ance, who was kind of the patriarch of the Hatfield clan in the feud.
Earlier that day, agents from the Banfield-Felts Detective Agency unlawfully evicted several coal miners, and Hatfield is determined to have a word with their leader, Albert Felts. Felts and his 13 agents arrive on foot, planning to board a train, but Hatfield blocks their path as his deputies close in, meeting them in front of a hardware store. When Hatfield tells Felts that he and his men are under arrest, Felts claims that he possesses a warrant to arrest Hatfield. They both know Felts is lying and share a dark laugh.
So this is, there's so much of like the Wild West going on here. This is 1920, so this is like 40 years after the Wild West. This is a good 30 years after the height of the Hatfield-McCoy feud. But this is the kind of stuff that went on where you had both sides of a feud or of a fight or of a war claiming the legal authority over the other, getting it from different agencies or just flat out making it up. Whatever can justify their use of force.
The town's mayor, also on site, asks to see Felts' warrant for the evictions. Felts produces a paper. The mayor, examining it, sees that it's bogus and says so. Felts then produces his gun. And what happens next triggers the largest American uprising since the Civil War, the Battle of Blair Mountain. Thanks so much to HelloFresh for continuing to help us bring history to the table. To understand how the Matewan Massacre led to the much larger Battle of Blair Mountain, one must look roughly 30 years before the incident and follow a trail of corporate greed and exploitation perpetrated by the United States coal industry. Though surprisingly, it doesn't start with the coal companies, but with the railroad combines that not only needed the coal to run their engines, but had the means to go into towns throughout the country and corner the market.
Money, coal, steel, oil, railroads, they're all interconnected. And then the government is connected to all of that. And so you have all kinds of scandals and briberies and corruption going on at various levels of government. And you have the rich wanting to get richer and taking advantage of those who are trying to make a living. It's all a mess.
Now, commercial coal mining started in the U.S. as early as 1701. And by the 1880s, many who needed to subsidize their household income, from local white farmers to European immigrants to African Americans, had settled near the West Virginia coal mines.
Yeah, a lot of Pennsylvania gets settled by Hungarian coal miners. Here in Ohio, I grew up in a town called Mineral Ridge, which was named for the fact that they found these really rich coal seams underneath. And it was Welsh coal miners because, of course, Wales has coal mines as well. A lot of them, Welsh coal miners, came to Mineral Ridge. And so I grew up with people with the last names like Evans and Davies and Watkins and, all these Welsh names.
But in the 1890s, well-heeled developers financed by the railroad companies showed up in Mingo County, where Matewan was located, looking to buy up as much land as possible. It wasn't just the land they were after, but the mineral rights.
Yep.
And once the necessary purchases were made, in came the construction crews. 5,000 strong, they performed the arduous task of chiseling 8 tunnels into the Appalachian foothills, giving the financiers full access to the black gold they had come for. Of course, in order to run a successful mining operation, the company had to lay down miles of railroad line and build roughly 60 bridges to transport the coal out, though despite the cost, it would prove to be a worthwhile investment. That's because the coal companies, already benefiting from American industrialization, would see even greater gains during World War I. Even before joining the war, the U.S. exported coal to its European allies. But when the war ended, so did that increased demand.
Yeah, coal fuels the steel industry. It fuels heating. It fuels all sorts of things. And you need cheap labor in order to get that large amount of coal that is needed to be produced. And so some of the poorest areas in America to this day are in eastern Kentucky and in southern West Virginia. And these are some of the highest coal-producing regions in the country. McDowell County, West Virginia, which is right on the border of where all this is going on, I think might be the poorest county in America. I actually got to speak there. I spoke at the McDowell County High School. Great school, great people, but a lot of depression and a lot of financial need that is there because once these coal companies came in, the people did hard work, lived short lives, regularly facing danger and death. If you did survive being in the mine, you dealt with lifelong health issues because of it, all while these guys are getting richer. And at some point, you look at that and you're like, this ain't right, this ain't fair. And that's when tensions begin to rise.
And when companies like Stone Mountain Coal Camp saw a loss in profits, their first move was to squeeze their workers. Stuck in the middle of this ebb and flow were the coal miners themselves. In their haste to put food on the table for their families, they collectively put themselves in a situation that made them practically indentured servants. This is how it worked. Once you signed on to join a mining outfit, you were provided with appropriate clothes, supplies, and even housing for you and your family. Sounds like a great deal, right? Except for the fact your supplies were leased from the company, and a fee for them came out of your pay.
So, and this wasn't just with the coal companies, this was all companies. My great-grandfather was a brick maker. That's what brought him from Kentucky to Ohio. Actually, both sides of my family, my mom and dad's side of my family, they came from Kentucky to work at Niles Fire Brick Company. And I've actually been through the records of Niles Fire Brick, looking at my great-grandfather and what he spent and what he earned. And they lived in company houses, which were provided by the company, but you paid for, and it came out of your check. You bought everything you needed at the company store, even stuff for your family, your food and everything. You even bought your coal for heating your house from the company. And so at the end of the day, his 2-week paycheck would be like $34 because of all of the stuff that had been deducted that he owed back to the company. It was a racket. It really was.
Also, the company store that you and your family bought provisions from, usually the only store in town, would often charge whatever they wanted.
And why was this the only store in town? Because these towns were built in places where there weren't towns. My grandfather was born in Letcher County, Kentucky, and the town he was born in was a coal mining town. His father, my great-grandfather, this is on my dad's side, was a foreman of one of these mines. And this whole town just grew up out of the need for a place to house the coal miners. So there was nowhere else to go but what was provided by the company.
Or still, instead of money, mining companies would issue scrip instead of actual pay that could only be spent in the company store. And keep in mind, coal mining itself is neither the easiest nor the safest job one could have. You're literally working in a cave, deep underground, chipping away at veins of coal.
And not necessarily always standing up tall. My grandfather-in-law worked a coal mine in Indiana County, Pennsylvania, and it was 22 inches high was the area that he was working in. They were laying on their backs on a cart. Scary, dirty, dangerous stuff.
And if someone gets careless with one of the lamps, a single spark could ignite the ambient dust, causing the entire mine to explode. In fact, one such incident killed 362 miners in Monongah, West Virginia in 1907, a mere 13 years before the events we're covering today. Now you'd think that because this dangerous work was essential to the economy, someone would actually advocate for these working class men. Perhaps someone at the federal, state, or heck, even local levels. But in most cases, you'd be wrong. Even in West Virginia, Governor John J. Cornwell, who had only one office in 1916 due to coal miner support, seemed reluctant to run afoul of the mining companies. In fact, when 5,000 angry miners rose up in nearby Logan County, he called the White House and requested federal troops to put down the uprising. As for the mining companies themselves, they had their ways of maintaining order. From subsidizing police forces like the one in Logan to flat-out bribing officials. They'd also employ men from the Baldwin-Felts Company, who, along with the on-the-take local law enforcement, would supervise activity within the mines.
You would think on the surface that it would be easier to use that money you're using to consolidate your power and to bribe officials just to pay your workers a little more, but this is not just about money, it's also about power, and it's about influence. It's about being able to do what you want.
These security officers occasionally roughed up miners to remind them who was boss and suppressed anything that resembled unionizing. Despite the mining company's use of threats and hired goons, representatives from the United Mine Workers of America showed up anyway, though they didn't exactly walk into town announcing themselves, for that would have prompted a quick and, more often than not, violent response from the Baldwin-Felts agents.
Just a decade or two earlier than this, there had been a national coal miners' strike that ended up involving Theodore Roosevelt as president having to get involved to resolve it. It just brought the economy to a standstill.
Instead, they'd usually sneak into town, pretending to be a salesman of some sort, quietly engaging miners on the sly until someone either listened to them, or they were found out and escorted out of town, or chased out, or beaten and told to leave. The Union leaders from the UMW realized that if the prosperous mines of West Virginia's southern border remained non-union, the situation would have an adverse effect on the Union's collective bargaining power in that region. But unionizing was a tough sell for most of the miners of Matewan. Many had been taught to distrust unions, either from company-produced literature or company-friendly preachers, which tended to claim all labor unions and their members were communists. And bear in mind, this was at a time when labor strikes across the country commonly devolved into street brawls or worse.
And just put yourself in the position of this worker. Yeah, you'd like to be on board with this stuff, but there's fear. You have a job. You don't want to lose your job. You don't want to lose your life. You don't want to be threatened by the people you see as quite powerful. You have a family to take care of. And some people would have looked and seen the United Mine Workers as just the other side of the same coin. These are other people who are after power and influence, and they don't like the fact that you're not a part of their union that represents so many other places. That's just one way it was viewed.
Participating could be dangerous. African-American miners were particularly reluctant to get themselves caught in any union talk, long resolved that there would never be any real upward mobility for them. They also knew that they were still better off than they had been as sharecroppers in the Jim Crow South. And the European migrants, well, they were pretty much under the same impression, given that they had no intention to return to their native lands. But the Matewan miners eventually did go union and launched a strike after an empty gesture wage increase that just so happened to coincide with a price hike at the company store, a tactic that left the miners with very little money. And it's worth mentioning here that despite the lingering racism and xenophobia of the time, all the miners stood together, black and white, native-born and immigrant, all united to seek fair pay and safer work conditions.
Isn't it interesting how that happens when you have a common cause and something to believe in and something to fight for? Suddenly you're not nearly as concerned with your differences with the guy next to you.
And that's when the terrorizing started. First came the evictions from company-owned housing, which was to be expected, so most of the displaced miners created a tent compound a few miles away from their abandoned houses, where they hunted small game and scavenged for food. And though a small emergency fund from the Union arrived, it was hardly enough for such a large group. Next, Baldwin-Felts agents took to strafing the tents with machine gun fire. Scared and injured, but not broken, the mining families nursed their wounded and stood their ground. And that's when the Stone Mountain Coal Corporation sent Baldwin-Felts agents to buy off Matewan's local politicians, as they'd done in other places. Except this time, it didn't work. Mayor Cobell Testerman was offered a bribe, hand-delivered by Albert Felts, the brother of one of the Baldwin-Felts founders. Felts wanted to station machine guns on the various roofs about the town, but out of loyalty to the mining community, Testerman refused the bribe.
Good for him.
And so did Police Chief Sid Hatfield, a former miner known for his carousing, his marksmanship, and his being related to the Hatfield side of the Hatfield-McCoy feud.
Yeah, so there was, right in that picture I mentioned,
his marksmanship and his being...
I mentioned Devil Ants, who, if you've seen the TV series, which is phenomenal, by the way, is played by Kevin Costner. That's Devil Ants right there in the picture. And this is all his clan, his kids and grandkids.
Related to the Hatfield side of the Hatfield-McCoy feud, he made it his mission to thwart the Baldwin-Felts agents during the months prior to the confrontation, often coming to the aid of coal miners and their families as they were being evicted. Hatfield even enlisted Sheriff George Blankenship, who helped slow the evictions to a crawl by arresting agents and tying evictions up in court. All this fueled a simmering animosity between the two factions, which spurred Felts to draw his gun during the railroad standoff. Gun blasts ring out, one after another. Felts shoots Testerman. Hatfield shoots Felts. Arrogance allowed the agents to get caught off guard, and the deputized miners, with their weapons mostly ready, take the advantage. When the smoke clears, 10 men are dead. Mayor Testerman, 2 miners, and 7 Baldwin-Felts detectives, including Albert Felts and his brother Lee. It was the first time the miners had clocked a win against Baldwin-Felts.
But here's the thing, and if you know from history how this goes, think back to 1876, Little Bighorn battle. Custer is defeated. He's wiped out with several companies of his regiment. It's a great victory for the Sioux and their allied tribes, but it's not a victory in the war. All that does is bring down the wrath of an incredibly powerful foe on yourself.
But if the Union men of Matewan thought that the shooting was done, they were dead wrong. And we'll tell you all about the Battle of Blair Mountain proper next episode.
All right, let's get right into part 2.
McDowell County, West Virginia, August 1st, 1921. 15 months after the Matewan massacre, Sid Hatfield, his friend Ed Chambers, their wives, and a bodyguard walk up the courthouse steps. Acquitted of all charges regarding the massacre, Hatfield and Chambers are here now to stand trial for new charges regarding the raid of a scab-run coal mine. They were supposed to have more protection, but instead they're greeted by a hit squad.
For those who aren't familiar, a scab is someone who, when there's a union on strike, scabs are the people that are brought in by the owners of the company to work in place of the union. And they're viewed very negatively by the union workers and often face violence and threats themselves.
Baldwin-Felts agents, seeking revenge for the 7 men they'd lost in the massacre, emerge from hiding and pump 4 rounds into Hatfield's chest. A third man shoots Chambers in the neck and keeps firing as he rolls down the steps. The bodyguard flees, Hatfield's wife runs for the police, and Chambers' wife beats one of the murderers with her umbrella. The assassins drag her away so she won't see them, planting guns on 2 of the dead men so they can claim self-defense. This was no mere assassination. It was the opening salvo of the oncoming battle. Thanks so much to Nebula for being, in our opinion, the best dang streaming service around. More on that, and how you can watch your first video free after the episode. When the coffins of Sid Hatfield and Ed Chambers made it back to Matewan, some 2,000 souls were in attendance to pay their respects and get one last look at their heroes. Unions in neighboring towns paid tribute by assembling labor committees, making statements, and initiating labor stoppages.
So what do you have now? Now you have a martyr, and this has been taken advantage of throughout history. Look at these people who died for our cause. Are we going to let that death be in vain? I mean, go all the way back to Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar gets assassinated as a dictator, as a tyrant, and the people who killed him thought they would be heroes. But Mark Antony gets up at the funeral and gives this speech that turns Caesar into a martyr and turns public opinion in his favor. And the same thing's going to happen here. You're going to use the deaths of these men to galvanize support for your side.
The community was stunned. After the gunfight at the Matewan courthouse, Hatfield had become a hero to coal miners, as well as a center of Union resistance. In fact, his shooting scrape inspired a self-contained guerrilla war in Mingo County, leading to armed skirmishes between miners and mining company agents. County officials had to finally declare martial law and threw hundreds of miners in jail. In his last months, Hatfield was in the middle of it all, which is probably why he'd been set up to stand trial in the mining company-friendly McDowell County. At the funeral, the mourners heard 2 very different messages. The Reverend spoke about faith and charity, but Hatfield compatriot Sam Montgomery was all about retribution. In his eulogy, Montgomery called out the mine owners, referencing them as sleek, dignified church-going gentlemen who would rather pay fabulous sums of money to their hired gunmen to kill and slay men for joining a union than pay the like or less amounts to the men who delved into the subterranean depths of the earth to produce their wealth.
And it's important to point out, too, that Sid Hatfield's not an old guy or even very middle-aged. He's like in his late 20s. He was a young dude when he was murdered.
Their outrage fueled the United Mine Workers, and UMW leadership argued over what to do next. Some wanted to march until all of the jails were filled, but others figured that would play right into the mining company's hands. So instead, they presented a list of demands to West Virginia Governor Ephraim Morgan that included freeing the miners imprisoned during the Mingo uprisings. He rejected those demands. As miners began to take to the streets in both Mingo and Logan counties, anti-union officials like Don Chafin, sheriff of Logan County, called in mounted state police to end the demonstrations. This only escalated tensions. When a trooper accidentally hit a parked car and armed officers started surrounding the owner, furious miners disarmed the state troopers and started patrolling the roads themselves.
When tensions get high like this and everybody starts to take sides, now every person you pass on the street who was once just your neighbor and somebody else who lived in your town, now it's like, okay, are they on our side or on the other side? Are they armed? Are they dangerous? And then little things happen where you bump into somebody's car and suddenly it turns into just one more piece of evidence about why that other side is absolutely evil and must be stopped at all costs.
Keeping the police out. By August 20th, 600 miners had assembled just outside of the town of Charleston, with scores of others on the way from neighboring counties. And while UMW leadership seemed to want to talk them out of marching to Mingo and demanding the uprising prisoners be freed, the miners were too far gone. Sid Hatfield had been murdered, and his killers were free, while Union men languished in jails. This, on top of everything else, was simply enough. Over the course of the next few days, the number of miners willing to make an armed march had swelled to 10,000. Equipped with a ragtag assortment of weaponry, including rifles that many of them had used to fight in World War I, the coal miners began their march to free their Union brothers. But to get to Mingo, the miners would have to take Logan County, and to do that, they'd have to make it over Blair Mountain. Sheriff Chafin, having heard about the planned march, swore that no armed mob would cross into Logan. To realize this promise, Chafin rounded up everyone he could, from deputies and vigilantes to strikebreakers and local farmers. He commandeered the county armory and stripped weapons from hardware store shelves. Then he set his forces to digging trenches and felling trees to block roads.
And this is legitimately turning into a civil war. And this has been going on for generations in this part of the world. Like I said, with the Hatfield and McCoys, which wasn't even the deadliest feud in this part of Appalachia. These are people who are descended from the Scots and the Irish and the British, the English, and they bring a lot of that animosity with them and that distrust of government and that distrust of the other side. And this is just the latest iteration of that.
And no doubt receiving some financial assistance from Big Coal, Chafin also had a fleet of cars to transport his men to the front when needed.
Motorized
warfare. Not convinced
warfare.
that Chafin could curtail the uprising, Governor Morgan reached out to President Warren Harding and the Secretary of War, demanding troops. Though when the White House sent a lukewarm response, Morgan applied media pressure by complaining to the New York Times, and that got results.
National Guard.
At 3 a.m. on Saturday, August 27th, Brigadier General Harry Bandholtz met with Governor Morgan. And when Bandholtz asked if Morgan had done everything he could to possibly avoid the uprising, the governor lied and said yes. Bandholtz, still hoping to avoid conflict, summoned Union leaders Frank Kennedy and Fred Mooney into a meeting and did not mince words. He told them that if this rebellion caused the president to call for martial law, not only would many miners die, but they would be held responsible. Now, Mooney and Keeney had been trying all along to prevent this uprising, but it was clear they'd have to try harder. It wasn't easy. But by driving around and spreading the word, they'd managed to move most of the miners to a ballpark in Danville. Many of the men were still adamant about continuing the march, but they reluctantly heard Mooney and Keeney out. And over time, the two Union leaders convinced the majority of the miners to go home. A tenuous truce descended. Though one man who wasn't interested in hearing them out was Bad Lewis White, who had managed to hijack a train.
I mean, if your nickname is Bad.
A day earlier, with the intent of taking it to Blair Mountain and eventually Logan as part of an armed attack. Though Mooney and Keeney were suspicious. White seemed to be going around everywhere, pedaling around on his bike, trying to rile miners up again. In fact, they suspected he was a provocateur, working with the mining companies to provoke a conflict.
It's certainly possible, and this is something that people always wonder about. When you see people acting in what you consider to be an irrational way, your rational brain wants to believe that there's a rational explanation other than just accepting the fact that sometimes people act in irrational ways, in ways that don't make sense to our brains.
Lending credence to their theory, Sheriff Chafin chose that moment for the state police to execute warrants against the miners who'd embarrassed and disarmed the mounted troops days prior. He was stirring the pot, seemingly doing everything he could to provoke a gunfight and bring in the army, and if that was his plan, it worked. The state police warrants sparked another shootout, with a few men killed and both sides managing to take prisoners. It was now Sunday the 28th, and word of the firefight spread, reigniting the miners' fury. The March on Mingo was back on. And fearing the wrath of General Bandholz, Keeney and Mooney left town, leaving a hot-headed man named Bill Blizzard in charge.
Bill Blizzard. That's fantastic. Once rationality goes out the door, as I mentioned a minute ago, and you're left with the hotheads, the irrational, the rational people, they're out. They're like, we've tried everything we can. I can't be a part of this. You got the union leaders trying their best, but now they're gone. And so now it leaves it to the hotheads on both sides and the ones who are going to bring this to violence. And then that's what it's going to take in order to calm things back down again.
Miners assembled, planning to attack Chafin's defenses on Blair Mountain. Their plan was to attack from two sides. But even with superior numbers, they were climbing uphill toward machine guns and prepared positions. Dozens of miners were hit before a machine gun jammed, allowing them to continue their bloody advance and draw within a few miles of Logan.
I can't help but think that some of these miners marching up this hill may have charged up Mont Falcon in 1918 during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, charging German machine gun positions, only to die in their own homes' backyards, fighting against other Americans.
In response, Chafin sent 3 rented biplanes to drop bombs on unsuspecting miners and, by some accounts, poisoned gas left over from the war. These aerial attacks managed to miss the mark, and no miners were killed or injured. But Chafin's forces did keep them out of Logan. On September 1st, with sporadic firefights still going on, Bandholz returned, promising amnesty to any miner that would halt their actions and go home.
I'll give this military guy credit. He's doing everything he can to avoid this escalating to the point where the military has to kill Americans.
With trust totally broken down by this point, the miners did not comply, so Bandholz ordered the troops in. But the army's arrival brokered a ceasefire. Miners, many of them veterans, did not want to fire on U.S. troops, and both sides thought the federal soldiers were a neutral mediator. Though, paradoxically, both Union men and coal companies thought the army would take their side. But while Bandholz reportedly thought Governor Morgan deserved most of the blame, it was largely the miners who were disarmed and taken into custody. Keeney, Mooney, and Bill Blizzard faced charges of treason, but only Blizzard went to trial. And he made the state's disproportionate use of force a cornerstone of his case, using an unexploded bomb as an exhibit, and was acquitted of all charges.
Okay.
But thanks to bad press and the mining company's manipulation of public perception, many labor unions, especially the UMW, were left weakened at every level. Their membership would plummet, and their credibility wouldn't be restored until the 1940s. Though it's over a century later, the need for unions and the struggle between miners and coal companies continues. In fact, recently, a rash of black lung disease linked to silica dust in the mines has struck Coal County. And across Appalachia, there are questions as to why employers have done little to protect their workers, and why decades of presidential administrations of both parties have failed to draft new regulations. So,
it's important to remember that. I mean, coal is still the primary means in the United States through which we get our electricity. And somebody's got to get that coal up. And yeah, we've got machines and we've got automation, but in the end, a lot of people go down into those mines and do dangerous work that even if you survive, shortens your life. So interesting. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. And if you have another extra history series we haven't done yet, and I've done a lot of them, let me know and we'll check it out. Thanks for watching.